Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about Total War Galactic Empires in the Star Wars universe, or Total War Star Wars, Star Wars Total War. Yeah, I think Star Wars Total War would work as a better title than Total War Star Wars, but that's just me. I'm curious to see what kind of title they'll have for it. But they are apparently working on a Star Wars game, on a Total War Star Wars game. And they have for a while. Now, there's various sources of information on this. The leak, quote unquote, that came out that indicated Creative Assembly was working on a Star Wars Total War game was from Dual Shockers. How much you want to believe that is up to you. However, it's worth remembering that Star Wars Total War was hinted in a survey that they did. So was 40K, so was World War I. So the big question mark has been, what kind of game are they going to do after Total War Warhammer 3? Personally, I would expect like an easy title for them to do would be an old world game, but maybe they want to wait for Games Workshop to develop that even further before they do it. But yeah, that is a possibility. But maybe a couple of years down the line. So there's been a bunch of discussion. A lot of people would argue like it's a 40K game. There's been people working in CA, leaking stuff to various content creators. But, well, the answer is apparently they're working on a lot of these titles, or all of these titles, at the same time. And ever since the leak, by the way, there's been some really good stuff coming out on Reddit. Not leaks, just fan stuff, fan art, memes, and all that. Like I look at this and it's like, you know what? I was skeptical when I first heard it, but then you look at this and it's like, good work, looking good. Gotta appreciate the people who have put the effort. And, you know, some people are gonna say, well, Star Wars doesn't have the same variety as 40K. Yeah, about that, it does. For the record, it does have a lot of variety. Even in the Disney universe. And one very important thing to make, one very important point to make with regards to Disney, LucasArts, compared to Games Workshop. Games Workshop is the kind of company that is very protective of their IP. To the point that when a developer is trying to make a Warhammer game, they will either allow them or disallow them to add certain things in the game. Like this has happened with Rogue Trader, it apparently happened with Mechanicus, it certainly has happened with Total War Warhammer 3. So Hagwitch Lords, for instance, or Null Ironsides, repeater handguns, that kind of stuff. It certainly is something like good on Games Workshop, for the record. They might screw up on their own, but they don't want a game developer to screw up their universe. Whereas Star Wars, well, Force Unleashed exists, Jedi Fallen Order exists. Like, consider Jedi Fallen Order. They literally created a race for that particular game. So Star Wars, like with the Star Wars license, you have a lot more flexibility than you might think with Warhammer, which is probably something that's good for game developers. And this has been the case all the time. Like, remember Star Wars Empire War? Forces of Corruption, the entire faction of Forces of Corruption, yeah, that was created for that game, specifically for that game. So there is a difference on that. But it's not just, oh, they're just making a Star Wars game. No, they're making every game under the sun, or a lot of them that you can imagine. The most important bit of information came from TWCenter, specifically this post. Now let me address the elephant in the room head on. Is this reliable? Well, if you're an old school Total War fan, if you're someone like myself who's played since Rome 1, Medieval 2, you know that TWCenter doesn't screw around. Like, I didn't used to be active on the official Total War forums back in the day. I was very active on TWCenter. This is where all the magic was happening. This is where mods like Darth Mod, Third Age Total War, Steel and Faith, and even a Warhammer mod, a Total War Warhammer mod, fantasy mod for Medieval 2 was made, which may have inspired Creative Assembly, or not. We don't know really. on that subject, but it may have inspired Creative Assembly to make a Warhammer fantasy game, because it was very popular. And the connections between TWCenter and Creative Assembly are very deep. Like, they've had connections for well over a decade and a half, like, basically for a very, very long time. Like, official modding competitions, Creative Assembly developers posting on the forum. And it's not just some random person posting, it's like the person, one of the people in charge of TWCenter posting this. So if they're posting this, it means that they've heard things from people they know in Creative Assembly. Now, with respect to any of those kind of leaks, it's obviously, you know, things within a company are subject to change, especially after the major disaster that Creative Assembly went through in what I would call Black October for them, because it was a disaster with Hyenas, Pharaoh, and Shouts of Change. But there's reason to believe that this is reliable. So, let's go over it. Total War Pharaoh. I know most of you don't care about Total War Pharaoh, so here's what they posted. They took a bet to mitigate the repercussions of pandemic bloat. So during the pandemic, a lot of game developers hired a bunch of people because they were making bank. Now you may have heard that a lot of gaming companies, a lot of IT companies are firing people. And so based on this post, Creative Assembly was hoping this game would succeed to help them keep more people by having a successful Saga game. It failed, and now they scrapped the planned DLC, and they're hoping to encourage potential customers to buy the game instead of trying to convince those that have already purchased to buy the DLC. And they do mention Mycenae, Troy, Assyria, Babylonia, Elam, and Chimerians. Then there's Warhammer 3. Now, the game is in a stable condition, performed very well in pre-orders, although it somewhat failed to meet CA's high expectations on DLC sales. And right now it is exiting its middle phase with around 1.5 years of development remaining. The next lore pack will feature Cafe and Ogres, which, by the way, Creative Assembly, when they did the official QA, they didn't mention this. Not necessarily that was going to be the next DLC, but that they were going to make another Cafe in DLC, and like a lot of people have speculated on that. So Monkey King and Golg Fag. Now, this is something like people have dived into the game files. They found things mentioning Golg Fag. They found things like the Monkey King is literally mentioned in the loading screens. And the last DLC will focus on the end times of Nagash and Neferata being its main advertising pillars. Okay, now this is not to say that there's only going to be 2 DLCs for Warhammer 3. Some people took this post to mean that. That is not the case, but like, yeah, Neferata and Nagash have like literally been mentioned in the game. Like, you look at Silver Pinnacle in the Darklands, that is a starting position if I've ever seen one. So yeah, Neferata is coming, Nagash is coming, we've all expected that. How many DLCs they will release? It depends on how much, like 1.5 years, so you're looking at 18 months. If they release a DLC every 3 months, there's potential for quite a few DLCs there. But it depends on how many resources, how many people, and what kind of DLCs that CA is going to make. Though it's worth pointing out plans to change. What they heard here probably was before CA decided to make DLC focused on free lords as opposed to just 2. So we'll see how that pans out in a couple of months when they do decide to release a new DLC. And it's going to be interesting to find out how often Creative Assembly is going to release DLC for that. But yeah, this is pretty reasonable and based and in line with other things I've heard. 'Cause see, if you follow the leaks, the question with like reliable leaks is like generally you will find other leaks, less reliable ones, which kind of say the same things, but it's that question of reliability. So yeah, you can trust what TWCenter is posting. You may not trust a bunch of random leaks like from DualShockers. People said, oh, IGN was hinting at the Star Wars game. No, it was DualShockers. How much you want to trust them? Far less than TWCenter. That's all I'm going to say. World War I. Unannounced project facing very serious difficulty. Its director resigned a year ago. Budget has been completely derailed. And it was originally planned for 2024. It got delayed, perhaps indefinitely. So we might see a World War I game. We might not see a World War I game. I guess we'll find out with respect to that. But that, I imagine, is the big next historical game. Warhammer 40k. This is something like Great Book of Grudges, other YouTubers have talked, like they have sources when Creative Assembly. So the development of 40k progresses without serious obstacles. The game was originally planned for 2025, but plans are subject to change. It is not, however, the flagship for the fantasy genre of Total War and serves more as a testing ground for the final and really ambitious project of CA. So let me talk about this. Now, I was a bit skeptical of this, but then I spent some time thinking about this. Like, why would they make Warhammer 40k as a testing ground when Warhammer 40k has so much potential? Well, let me explain why. One, as popular as Warhammer is not Star Wars. Like, I say this as a huge Warhammer fan and as someone who is not happy with Star Wars at the moment. But freaking Star Wars, I'm sorry, like Star Wars is much bigger than 40k. Like in terms of the fan base, in terms of popularity. Warhammer is very popular among gamers, to be sure, but Star Wars is a very different affair. And there are a lot of things they need to do. Like, in terms of campaign mechanics, they've done a lot of good things, but it's really the battles. Because you might say, oh, you can make range battles work. Let me say this. If I see a fucking Warhammer 40k game where we line up our Space Marines in a line and we charge the enemy on a square map, that is going to be freaking stupid. You got to conserve things like cover. You got to get better maps. You got to talk about space battles. So there's a lot of things. I really don't know how they're going to do that. They haven't done naval combat in Total War games for a long time. Like you can't have a 40k game without space combat unless they do it something like Dawn of War, Dark Crusade, which honestly would be very disappointing if that was the case. But they might do so. And then you get into Star Wars. This is the studio's big flagship. It has the potential to attract a huge audience and can also rely on an enormous pool of DLC for long-term support exploitation. It's still far from release, as at least 40k is in a much more advanced stage of development. So it's likely they're working on 40k, and then once they're done with 40k, they're going to move on to Star Wars. That is it. Now, some people that don't know as much about Star Wars are wondering, wait, how the hell would you get so much content from Star Wars? Let me be very clear. Star Wars is a lot more diverse than you might think. Like, Warhammer 40k is certainly very diverse, but there is a very big difference. Like, Games Workshop, as I said, it's like they are very careful about what they allow developers to show of their IP and changes and all that, whereas Star Wars is less so. And there's a lot of races. Like, just look at the Clone Wars show, like the number of races, planets, diversity of factions, potential. Like, it's not just like, let's take the Clone Wars. It's not just the Separatists. Like, the Separatists, even in the movies, were made up of a half a dozen factions or a dozen factions at least, with their own armies, like units, ships, you name it. The Republic, again, same thing. You have things like Kuat, you have the Jedi Order, you have Corellia, and many other things. Naboo, etc., etc. I do think Naboo should not be its own thing, because like Naboo is not really that relevant. But yeah, Coruscant, Kuat, Corellia, other planets, other minor powers that are part of the Republic, yeah, those can be their own freaking factions. And you want to talk about legendary lords? It's like, holy shit, just take the entire freaking Jedi Order. There's a legendary lord pool larger than what Warhammer 3 has at the moment. And it's no joke. And then Free Kingdoms 2 cancelled. CA attempted to recover its momentum by abandoning Free Kingdoms and relaunching a newer and even less expensive version of the game under Jack Lusted, but the project was terminated yesteryear. This is the second Total War game cancelled in recent history, after an unannounced historical game originally scheduled to release after Warhammer 3 was cancelled, when the project was still in its infancy. The reason was that CA wanted to produce more quickly a cheaper game to make in order to appease the historical fans following the atrocious reception of Warhammer 2 trailer and the disappointing sale figures of that game as well as its predecessor. Interesting. Anyway, so yeah, Free Kingdoms, this is something I've heard before. Like, other people have said this, leaks have said it. I think it was Bellular who was saying this as well, like a couple of months ago. So, yeah, Free Kingdoms 2 is not happening. What I've personally heard from someone that worked in Creative Assembly is that they had issues with the Chinese audience that they didn't expect. And that's one of the reasons they ended up canceling Free Kingdoms. They were hoping to address that, but yeah, it just didn't work out. So if you're hoping for a Free Kingdoms 2 game actually focused on the Free Kingdoms period, yeah, it is disappointing. I had hoped for more from Free Kingdoms, but just didn't work out, really. So that's about it. Now, how do I feel about it? Well, I think the Warhammer 3 stuff makes perfect sense. Pharaoh stuff makes perfect sense. Like, I believe all of this, don't get me wrong. Like, I think, like, they wouldn't, TWCenter would not post it if they weren't certain about their information. Though keep in mind, subject to change. World War I's 40k Star Wars Free Kingdoms, like the Free Kingdom stuff, yeah, absolutely the case. But what about like new games? Like if you're gonna have World War One, like World War One cannot freaking be just like, oh, we line our gunpowder units on a freaking line or multiple lines on the battlefields on battle maps similar to Warhammer 3 and just charge the enemy. That is not World War One. It is tricky, actually. It's quite tricky. Like there was a World War One game for Petroglyph. I personally disliked it. I get it. It's difficult to make. But yeah, new engine. It does feel like they're making a new engine for those three games: World War One, 40k, and Star Wars. Star Wars probably quite a few years from release, but it's surprising to think like a year ago people were wondering, wait, is CA even making a Total War game? Beyond that, because we were wondering like what is their future, like beyond the saga stuff. Like, are they gonna make another mainline Total War game? Well, apparently they're making 5 of them or 6 of them, depending on who you ask. So yeah, Great Book of Grudges was saying like they're making half a dozen games. It's like, geez. I mean, if Hyena's cancellation was gonna sink CA, I guess we were very wrong. I guess it explains why Sega did keep CA along if this was something that they were already working on. All right. I mean, I suppose it also makes more sense given, it also puts in perspective the message Rob Bartholomew shared, right? About, like, if you're not going to support us, if you're not going to buy DLC, we won't make it, because they had a lot of things in the oven that they were working on. So yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I get it from the perspective of a lot of people. Like it would make more, like from my perspective, it would make more sense to release Star Wars first, use that as a test bed. But I get why they would do it in reverse. Like Star Wars is gonna make a lot more money than 40k. I'm sorry, like I have a lot of issues with Star Wars, but it's freaking Star Wars. Like I don't think people realize just how big that is. You have mediocre games being released for Star Wars that do significantly better than any Warhammer game that has ever come out. Like that's just simple freaking reality. You release a good and what they're doing is very sensible. You focus on 40k, you build up the foundations of a space combat game, futuristic game, and then you use that foundation to build a Star Wars game after you've cooked enough. You've had it in the oven enough, you use that foundation, you improve on it, and make a Star Wars game. That has the potential of genuinely making them $1 billion. So you can imagine that is what CA is thinking about. Makes sense. Like, it just makes sense. We'll see what happens over the next few years. But we might get a 40k game next year. That would be very surprising. I guess we have to wait for Gamescom to see if there's any announcements then from Creative Assembly, but we shall see. Costin signing out. It's certainly a very interesting time, isn't it? Jeez, I thought Thrones of Decay was moving in the right direction, but damn, this is going to be very interesting. I'm not so sure I'm sold on the Monkey King versus Golgfag, but we'll see about that. Nagash and Ephraim makes sense, though.